When a former Los Angeles prosecutor clashed with a burglar who broke into his home, he had no idea how complex and strange the outcome of the case would be. And when it was all over, he desperately tried to understand why it happened. The only answer he could see: diet pills were the cause of the shocking crime. It was a quiet September evening in 1996. Former Los Angeles prosecutor, 50-year-old Jose Garza, was spending time with his beloved wife, Nicole, when she suddenly craved some diet ice cream. She asked her husband to fetch it from the garage, where it was stored in the freezer. Jose readily went to get the ice cream. It was almost 11 p.m. The house in Silmar, a suburb of Los Angeles where the couple lived with their 3 young children, was mostly enveloped in darkness, as was the street around it. Suddenly, the cozy silence was broken by the family's dogs barking. Jose stopped halfway, alarmed by the sharp and insistent barking. Could someone be trying to break into the house? He decided to check, but first he retrieved a pistol from a locked cabinet, one of the many in his collection. Jose cautiously opened the garage door, slowly reached for the light switch. At that very moment, 3 gunshots rang out. The flashes of light that illuminated the garage allowed Jose to catch a glimpse of the shooter. To his horror, he saw a figure that reminded him of a ninja with dark clothing, a wig, glasses, and a mask covering the face. The person had started shooting without any warning. Fortunately, the bullets missed their mark. Jose, holding his pistol, returned fire. He fired just once, but that was enough. The dark figure clutched their stomach and collapsed to the floor. Jose didn't risk approaching the person on the ground, nor did he remove the mask from their face. After all, what difference did it make what the person looked like? Let the police handle that. The important thing was that he and his family were safe, or so he thought at that moment. Therefore, Jose rushed to the phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they asked the neighbors to watch over the couple's 3 young children while they took Jose Garza and his 32-year-old wife Nicole to the station to give their statements. Meanwhile, officers examined the crime scene. The man who had attacked Jose was still lying curled up on the garage floor between the boiler and the freezer, with blood flowing from his abdomen. Without removing his mask, glasses, or wig, they transported him to the hospital, while the forensic team began collecting evidence. They found no signs of robbery or forced entry into the home. Even the garage door was closed, so how did he get inside? However, the forensic team did discover the assailant's revolver and 2 bullet marks on the door leading from the kitchen to the garage. It was clear that Jose had miraculously escaped death. Additionally, on the garage floor, the forensic team found a bracelet with keys to a Ford Bronco, which did not belong to anyone in the Garza family. At the station, the husband and wife were questioned separately. This was done because spouses tend to speak for each other, which can interfere with the interview process. Jose was very active during his questioning. He immediately sought to secure the detectives' agreement that he had not exceeded the acceptable limits of self-defense. As a former prosecutor, although he dealt primarily with minor offenses, he had successfully prosecuted criminals and gang members, potentially making enemies along the way. Aware of this, he was prepared to act accordingly. He collected firearms and knew how to use them. However, he was now anxious about whether the police would agree that he had the right to return fire after the intruder shot at him 3 times. The conversation with Nicole, however, had a completely different tone. Despite what had happened in her home and the fact that she was at the police station, she was completely relaxed. She calmly recounted that before the incident, she and her husband were enjoying each other's company in the bedroom. After some intimate moments, she craved something sweet and asked Jose to bring her some diet ice cream. It was stored in the garage, so Jose went to fetch it. Suddenly, she heard gunshots, and her husband rushed back to call the police. He then took their children, who were also frightened by the loud noises, to their room. While detectives were interviewing the couple, unexpected news arrived from the hospital. It turned out that the burglar who had shot at Jose 3 times was a woman. She had no identification on her, and her identity had not yet been established. But just the fact that the shooter was female immediately shifted the investigation in a new direction. The detectives suddenly had a lot of new questions. Could this have been one of Jose's 2 ex-wives? Or perhaps a lover? Jose confidently dismissed all these suggestions. Nicole also couldn't name any woman who would want her husband dead. At one point, a detective was asked to step out of the interrogation room for a moment. When he returned, his first question to Nicole was, "Tell us about your relationship with your sister." This was an incredible twist because the armed ninja turned out to be Nicole's own sister, Lynette LaFontaine Trujillo. When Jose was informed of the identity of the person who attacked him, he was genuinely surprised. He stated that he wasn't very close to his wife's sister and didn't understand why this fragile woman, a mother of 4, would shoot at him. But here's the strange thing. When detectives began questioning Nicole about her sister, she didn't even bat an eye. In other words, suddenly and out of nowhere, police investigators start pressing her about a family member, and she didn't find that odd at all. But why did Lynette try to kill Jose? Was she jealous of her sister's family? Did she intend to kill just the man, or was she planning to go upstairs to harm her sister and nieces and nephews too? The couple couldn't answer these questions, so they were allowed to go home. Moreover, despite Lynette's critical condition, she had regained consciousness, and detectives decided to try to question her directly. They rushed to the hospital. Lynette, of course, couldn't speak, but she could potentially write down answers in a notebook. As soon as the police entered her room, Lynette gestured as if she was writing with a pen on paper. But when given a notebook, she only wrote 2 words, Diet Cola, and then fell back asleep. They tried to find a clue in the woman's life. Friends who knew the red-haired sisters Nicole and Lynette well recalled that the girls were very popular and well-liked by everyone. Despite their popularity, the sisters were completely different. Lynette was as creative and artistic as her younger sister was intelligent and serious. Nicole found studying incredibly easy and completed her homework without any difficulty. As they grew older, the differences between them became even more pronounced. Nicole achieved success in life, earning a higher education and becoming a divorce attorney. A beautiful, well-off woman, she created a wonderful family with a respected prosecutor. This was her second marriage. Her sister could only envy her. Lynette, on the other hand, struggled to find purpose in life. From an early age, she dealt with a series of problems. She lacked self-confidence and struggled to accept herself as she was, leading to bulimia. This was followed by a dependency on illegal substances and disappointments in love. She married Miguel Trujillo and had 3 sons, but their relationship didn't stand the test of time. During the divorce, Nicole represented her sister. In 1994, Lynette became a mother again. However, like her previous 3 children, this son also stayed with his father. After this relationship ended, Lynette moved back into her parents' house. At 34 years old, she was living with her parents and working double shifts as a waitress. But she missed her children terribly and would see them whenever she had the chance. However, life's misfortunes don't automatically turn someone into a killer. Lynette must have had a serious motive to commit such a horrific crime. The answer came with the discovery of the Ford Bronco, which belonged to Lynette. The car was found early in the morning, parked a couple of blocks away from the Garza family home. The key found in the garage matched the lock. Inside the vehicle, officers discovered a bag filled with damp, torn pieces of paper. The officers thought the papers were incriminating enough to be destroyed, yet important enough to be kept. This case was turning into a puzzle, literally. It took the team quite a bit of time to piece together the text on the sheets, but when the fragments started to come together, they realized they held the key to solving the case. The torn paper pieces were once letters. There was no signature or date, but as the fragments were reassembled, it became clear that these were letters sent to Lynette. The letters contained detailed instructions on how to kill Jose. Specific recommendations were given. Wear a wig but no makeup. Bring gloves. Get a manicure to shorten your nails. Gunshots are very loud. Don't scream, don't be late for work, and act normal the next day. The author of the letters expertly manipulated Lynette's emotions, convincing her to commit this dreadful crime. You're mentally strong enough to do this and forget about it. You're stronger than you think. A minute and a half of terror and your life will change completely. Thanks to these letters, it became clear that someone had convinced Lynette to commit the crime, and that someone was Nicole, as the letters also mentioned, Mom. Investigators were able to uncover that Nicole had long been complaining to her sister about her marriage. She convinced Lynette that Jose was abusive, that he humiliated her and mistreated her in intimate ways. Nicole insisted that everyone would be better off if he simply disappeared. In one of the letters, she wrote to Lynette, promising that once it was all over, she would take care of her sister and her children. Nicole assured Lynette that she would help her get the breast surgery she had always wanted, find her a better job, and assist her in gaining custody of her children. In her desperation, Lynette, a mother of 4 who saw no light at the end of the tunnel in her life, agreed to help her sister. Nicole was arrested on September 27th, just 1 day after the shooting. Jose couldn't believe what the investigators were telling him. He quickly hired the best lawyer for his wife and visited her regularly in jail. Jose insisted that despite the nearly 20-year age difference and the fact that they had only been married for a few years, he and his wife were the perfect couple and deeply in love. The best evidence of this, he said, was their 3 children. A few days later, Lynette passed away in the hospital. She never regained consciousness and was unable to tell her side of the story. Her 4 young children were now motherless. Lynette's youngest son was told that his mother was working a lot and couldn't see him. The middle son was convinced that she had abandoned them, and the eldest, a 10-year-old boy, called other family members twice a day to make sure they hadn't disappeared like his mother. How can you explain to a young child that his mother is dead, killed by his uncle, and that his aunt is in jail? Lynette's relatives wondered. On October 8, 1996, Nicole was officially charged with the murder of her sister, conspiracy, and attempted premeditated murder. Although she didn't pull the trigger, from a legal standpoint, Nicole created the situation that led to her sister's death. On Tuesday, September 24th, the day before the attack, she gave Lynette a revolver, the keys to her house, and instructions printed from a computer. Everything was supposed to go smoothly, but that night, Jose also took a gun. Not only did he manage to avoid being shot, but he also hit the attacker. Nicole hadn't anticipated this outcome. As she wrote to her sister, the first bullet would surely kill her husband. But if something went wrong, Lynette was supposed to fire 2 more shots into his back. However, detectives found it odd that Nicole gave her sister a revolver from her husband's collection, one of the least effective weapons for the task at hand. One might think Nicole handed her the first revolver she found, but she knew firearms well and was aware of what she was doing. Detectives believe she had no intention of helping Lynette get back on her feet. In fact, they think she never intended to leave her accomplice, even if it was her own sister alive. According to their theory, she wanted Jose and Lynette to shoot each other, and she would then finish off whoever survived. Without the letters, Nicole might have gotten away with everything, but those fragments of paper tightly connected her to the crime. Consequently, she pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and attempted murder, thereby avoiding the most severe punishment for her crimes, life imprisonment without parole. In January 1997, she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. However, she never explained her motive. She constantly complained to her sister about financial and personal problems, alleging that Jose kept her and the children on a tight leash and controlled everything. But even if this were true, the first thing that should have come to an unhappy wife's mind was divorce, not murder. However, if her husband died, she would receive his insurance payout, pension as a former Los Angeles prosecutor, all the real estate, and all of Jose's savings. Naturally, she didn't want to get her hands dirty, so she convinced a family member to commit the murder for her. This is why even Nicole's relatives couldn't forgive her, because the murderer not only took away her sister's children's mother, but also her own. Due to one reckless decision, 7 children were left without their mothers. Nicole was released in 2012. She remarried and moved to Arizona with her husband. She lives an ordinary life as if nothing ever happened and has no contact with her now adult children. Nicole manipulated her sister and her husband. The judge remarked that this case resembled Franz Kafka's works in its darkness and plot twists. For Jose, the whole ordeal seemed surreal. He had always supported his wife and blamed everything on the diet pills Nicole had been taking for 5 months before the attack. She had lost 60 pounds, but he believed that the pills had changed not only her appearance, but also her behavior. Jose was convinced that, under normal circumstances, she would never have conceived a plan to kill him. After his wife's arrest and charges, Jose went through an extremely difficult time. At first, he couldn't even think about divorce and kept his wedding ring on for a long time. Despite his children being young, they remember him crying in the bedroom or bathroom, trying to stay strong only for their sake. Nicole didn't kill Jose as she intended, but she did kill an important part of him.
Italy is a dream that keeps returning for the rest of your life. Meredith Kercher would have wholeheartedly agreed with this famous poet's words. She had been enchanted by Italy ever since she first visited from the UK with her family at the age of 8. Cherishing those childhood memories, Meredith began studying Italian in the 9th grade. The language came easily to her, especially after she participated in a student exchange program that same year and spent 2 weeks in southern Italy with her classmates. That trip changed Meredith's life. She fell completely in love with the country, and on the final day, while her classmates were sad about leaving, Meredith, uniquely, was smiling. When asked why she wasn't upset, she replied, "I'm not sad, because I know that when I'm older, I'll live here. I know Italy will always be a part of my life." At 18, Meredith enrolled at the University of Leeds, studying Italian and European politics. The program offered a year abroad, and in August 2007, 21-year-old Meredith packed her bags and headed to Italy. She chose the city of Perugia, located in the heart of the country, in the region of Umbria. Perugia is a picturesque city, home to one of Italy's 3 universities, specifically for international students. Meredith moved into a charming 2-story cottage nestled on a hill. 4 young Italian men lived downstairs. On the upper floor were 2 friendly Italian students, Filomena Romanelli and Laura Mazzetti, who warmly welcomed Meredith. The room next to hers was empty, but not for long. The Italian girls told her that in a few weeks, a 20-year-old student from the United States named Amanda Knox would be moving in. On Friday, November 2nd, 2007, Perugia resident Elisabetta Lana shivered as she stepped onto her porch in the chilly air. She was heading toward her beloved rose bushes when she heard a phone ringing from the bushes in her garden. Following the sound, she discovered a mobile phone. Elisabetta reported the find to the police. Officers quickly identified the phone as belonging to Italian student Filomena. What they didn't yet know was that Filomena had given the SIM card to her roommate Meredith Kercher so she could contact friends in Italy without racking up expensive charges. Nor did they know that, at that very moment, Filomena was answering a call from another of her roommates, Amanda Knox. Amanda explained that she had spent the night at her boyfriend Raffaele Solicito's house and had returned around 11 a.m. to take a shower and change clothes. To her surprise, the front door was wide open, though no one was home. She noticed drops of blood on the faucet and a reddish stain on the bath mat in the bathroom, but assumed that Meredith had started her period. As for the blood on the sink, Amanda said it came from herself. She had recently pierced her ears. Then Amanda went to retrieve a hairdryer from the other bathroom, the one shared by Filomena and Laura Mazzetti. To her shock and disgust, she found feces in the toilet. Knowing how tidy her roommates were, Amanda became frightened, left the house, and called Filomena. Filomena asked Amanda to go back inside and check the other rooms. Then she tried to call Meredith. Meredith had 2 SIM cards, an Italian one, given by Filomena, and a British one. She never turned off her British phone because her mother had fragile health, and it was important that her family could reach her at any time. But now Meredith wasn't answering. Filomena listened to the ringing, increasingly worried. She called Amanda again. By that time, Amanda had stopped by Raffaele's, and together the young couple returned to the girls' cottage. There, they discovered a window in Filomena's room was smashed, and her belongings were scattered everywhere, though oddly, nothing appeared to be missing. Meanwhile, just 500 meters from the girls' house, near Elisabetta's garden, another mobile phone was found, this time with a British SIM card. That afternoon, 2 officers arrived at the cottage to return the recovered phones. They noticed a young couple standing outside. It was Amanda and Raphael. By a strange twist of fate, the students were already waiting for the police, as someone had broken into their home, and they couldn't get in touch with one of the roommates, Meredith. Her bedroom door was locked, and she hadn't answered when they knocked or called her name. Amanda led the police officers into the house, pointed out the large rock used to smash the window in Filomena's room, and took them to the locked door of Meredith's bedroom. By that time, the other tenants who lived in the cottage had also arrived. Since the police didn't have a warrant, they had no legal right to force entry. Fortunately, the students were not concerned with such formalities. As soon as the guys broke down the door, the girls screamed in horror. The scene that unfolded before them was horrific. Bright red splashes of blood covered the entire room. On the floor lay a blanket, carelessly thrown over something. The 2 feet sticking out from underneath left no doubt about what was hidden there. The officers immediately escorted everyone out of the house to preserve the crime scene and called for backup. Under the blanket lay the body of 21-year-old Meredith Kercher. She was almost completely nude. On the left side of her neck gaped a large wound. Her clothes and underwear were scattered around the victim. Her bra had been roughly torn off. While forensic experts began collecting evidence, Meredith's neighbors stood outside. Journalists had already gathered near the house, unashamedly filming everyone present, especially Amanda and Raphael. Later, Raphael would say that Amanda told him how far away her parents were, that she was all alone in Italy and had no one to support her during such a terrible time. He replied, "Don't worry, I'm here with you." And then he kissed her. A kiss captured by the very first reporters on the scene. A kiss that, very soon, would be used against them. The broken window in Filomena's room raised suspicions among the police. First of all, the rock used to break. It was too heavy to be easily thrown through the glass. A smaller stone would have done the job. Secondly, the glass shards were lying on top of Filomena's belongings. But if the intruder had broken the window first, then climbed inside and searched the room, the glass would have ended up underneath her things. Investigators suspected the break-in had been staged and that the window was actually broken from the inside. Meanwhile, the pathologist conducted an autopsy. The fatal wound, an 8-centimeter cut on the left side of the victim's neck, had been inflicted with a sharp knife. It was a deep wound that caused severe bleeding and breathing difficulties. It had been delivered in a single powerful strike. Meredith's body also bore around 50 bruises and small cuts on her face, neck, arms, and upper body. She had clearly fought back against her attacker. And given that Meredith had practiced karate for several years, there is no doubt she knew how to defend herself. But the killer was stronger. There were signs of an attempted sexual assault. As for the time of death, Meredith died sometime between 9:30 p.m. and midnight. The police began interviewing the victim's friends. Since she had been found naked, investigators were particularly interested in her male acquaintances, especially her Italian boyfriend, who lived on the first floor of the same cottage. But fortunately for him, on the night of the murder, he was at his parents' home, 150 kilometers away from Perugia. November 1st is a national holiday in Italy, a day to honor the saints of the Catholic Church. So many students had gone home to their families. Meredith, for her part, spent the evening with friends. They hung out at one of the girls' houses, ordered pizza, and watched a movie. Meredith and her friend Sophie left around 9 p.m. Meredith planned to go to bed early since she had class the next day. The two girls left together, and Sophie was the last person to see Meredith alive, aside from the killer. Based on her friends' testimony, police concluded that Meredith had returned home by 9:15 p.m. When Meredith returned home, there was no one else in the cottage. The guys, Filomena and Laura, had all gone away. Amanda said that on November 1st, her boss, Patrick Lumumba, the owner of the pub where she worked part-time, messaged her to say she didn't need to come in that night because business was slow. So Amanda and her boyfriend, Raphael, took the opportunity to spend a romantic evening together. They stayed at his place, cooked fish for dinner, and watched a movie. They stayed up late, relaxed, and used illegal substances, specifically cannabis. Amanda woke up around 10 a.m. on November 2nd and went back home. Fortunately, it wasn't far. She wanted to take a shower and change clothes since she didn't like the bathroom at Raphael's, your typical messy bachelor bathroom, mold and all. What happened next, when Amanda returned home, was already known to the police. The officers continued interviewing Meredith's acquaintances, and some of them mentioned that tensions had arisen between her and Amanda. At first, Meredith had helped Amanda settle into her new home, but soon the new roommate began to irritate her. Meredith complained to friends that Amanda didn't help keep the house clean. In addition, she would bring men home, whose presence made Meredith uncomfortable. When the police checked Amanda and Raphael's phones, they discovered that both had turned off their mobile phones on the night of November 1st to 2nd. This detail intrigued the detectives, and from that moment on, the net around Amanda and Raphael slowly began to tighten. 4 days after the murder, it was Raphael's turn to give his testimony at the station. Amanda accompanied her boyfriend and waited for him in the hallway. It's worth noting that all the other students questioned by the police came to the station with either their parents or a university professor. But for some reason, Raphael and Amanda didn't think it was necessary. Raphael recalls being led into a dark room with a single lamp burning on the table. The investigator began bombarding him with questions. Under pressure, Raphael admitted that due to the cannabis, the last few days had blurred together in his mind. He couldn't be entirely certain that Amanda had spent the entire evening with him on the night of the murder. He started to think she may have met with friends at the pub where she worked and returned around 1 in the morning. As for himself, he recalled returning home alone at 9 p.m., having dinner, and watching the movie Amelie. With this statement, Raphael completely distanced himself from Amanda, undermining her alibi. What he didn't yet realize was that he had also just destroyed his own. Meanwhile, the police continued to make progress. The sole of Raphael's shoe closely matched the footprints found near Meredith's body. To the investigators, this meant Raphael had been at the crime scene. He was no longer just a witness, he was now a suspect. However, the students still didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. In the hallway, Amanda was patiently waiting for her boyfriend. But people like Amanda can't sit still for long. She had always been known for her activity, impulsiveness, and excessive energy. Even at the police station, while her boyfriend was being questioned in a murder investigation, Amanda couldn't sit still. To stretch a little, she began doing yoga poses, something she would later be reminded of many times. Since Amanda was still sitting in the corridor, the police took the opportunity to question her again. They found a text message on her phone that Amanda had sent to her boss, Patrick. She wrote, "See you later. Good evening." Amanda explained that this was just a direct translation from English, meaning they would see each other sometime later. But for the investigators, this was proof that Amanda hadn't spent the entire evening with Raphael, but had met with Patrick. Her interrogation lasted all night. She was denied food and drink and wasn't allowed to use the restroom. They called her a stupid liar. At one point, an officer slapped her on the head and told her she'd better remember what had happened. By 2 in the morning, Amanda was exhausted, drained, and willing to say anything just to be left alone. That's when the investigator asked her to imagine what she would see and hear if she were at the crime scene. Amanda replied that she would hear Meredith scream and covered her ears in horror, picturing how it could have happened. She answered hypothetically, not knowing this was a police tactic to try to extract a confession. The police continued to pressure her, insisting they knew Patrick had been at her house and that Amanda needed to tell everything. The girl broke down in tears. She was tired, had poor Italian comprehension, and no strength to argue. She believed the police knew Patrick had killed Meredith. Amanda agreed that she had met Patrick that evening. They entered the cottage together. Patrick was alone with Meredith. Amanda was in the kitchen and heard Patrick assault and kill Meredith. So after a grueling night of questioning at the station, Amanda accused Patrick and admitted she had been home when he killed her neighbor. In the morning, police arrested a bewildered Patrick who was at home with his small son. The murder of Meredith Kircher seemed solved. The city's prefect rushed to inform the public. He addressed a crowd of journalists announcing that Patrick Lumumba, Amanda Knox, and Rafael Solicito were charged with violence and murder. A few hours after the arrest, Amanda regained her composure and wrote a letter to the police explaining that she had been talking nonsense. She hadn't seen Patrick that day and had spent the evening with her boyfriend. But despite Amanda's withdrawal of her statements, the wheels of justice were already in motion. Meanwhile, the omnipresent journalists hurried to learn everything they could about the couple. Amanda Knox is 20 years old. She was born in Seattle, USA, to a family with a mathematics teacher mother and an accountant father. Amanda had an easy time learning languages, and long before traveling to Italy, she was already reading her favorite Harry Potter book in German. After visiting Italy, she decided she wanted to return. The young woman worked 3 jobs to save money for the trip. Finally, her dream came true. She arrived in the city of Perugia 2 months before the murder. She was an excellent student at the local university, studied hard, and worked twice a week at a pub to earn a little money and be as independent as possible. Together with Meredith, she attended a classical music concert where she met Raphael. Raphael admitted that there was something childlike about Amanda. She was always daydreaming, and this carefree nature attracted other people to her. She was spontaneous and very energetic. She was always daydreaming, and this carefree nature attracted other people to her. She was spontaneous and very energetic, possibly too much so. At any moment, she might jump up, start dancing, singing along, or doing some sports exercises. However, her quirks never crossed the line and were often even considered charming. Her boyfriend, Rafael Solicito, is 23 years old and studies computer engineering. He was born in southern Italy to a family of a urologist doctor. His mother recently passed away, and his father did everything to surround his son with attention and care. Rafael was a shy, homebody boy who studied well, loved his family and friends, and never had any trouble with the law. Since Amanda and Raphael had no criminal drama in their lives, the media began to freely distort facts, artificially creating a sensation. On social media, they found a photo of Amanda from a museum where she was pictured holding a machine gun, and a photo of Raphael dressed as a mummy with a cleaver and a bottle of bleach. Journalists criticized Amanda's school nickname, Fox Knox, portraying her as a promiscuous seductress. However, this nickname was actually given to Amanda by other girls from the football team because she was very agile. The couple was condemned for going to a clothing store the day after the murder to buy Amanda new underwear, but it was overlooked that Amanda was forbidden to take anything from her room since the entire house was considered a crime scene. So she simply needed new clothes, including underwear. What reporters criticized most was a kiss they exchanged on the street when the body was discovered, accusing them of showing disrespect to the deceased. But could a 20-year-old couple really be prepared for how to behave near the site of a recent murder? The case was handled by investigator and prosecutor Giuliano Menini. He believed Meredith died as a result of a sexual orgy led by Amanda, with Patrick and Raphael trying to please her. Therefore, the police decided to find out how sexually active Amanda was, as it fit their theory. While in jail, she was given a blood test and told she had HIV. Shocked, Amanda named all 7 men she had ever had intimate relations with. 2 weeks later, she was told, "Oops, sorry, we made a mistake. You're healthy." But the police leaked that list of men to the press. It's hard to believe such tactics, revealing deeply personal information to manipulate public opinion and add sensationalism, are still used today. Meanwhile, the police searched Patrick's house and pub, but found nothing. The search of Amanda's room also yielded no results. However, at Raphael's house, the officers came across Japanese comics, violent pornographic manga about the murder of female vampires on Halloween. This caught the police's attention because Meredith had chosen a vampire costume for Halloween. The description of the murder scene in the manga was similar to the real murder scene in Meredith's bedroom. Additionally, officers found a knife with an 18-centimeter blade in a kitchen drawer that could have caused the wound on the victim's throat. The knife had been washed, but Amanda's DNA was found on the handle, and Meredith's DNA was found on the blade. This was taken as confirmation that this was the murder weapon. From this, the unambiguous conclusion followed. The person who committed the crime was Amanda Knox. Things were not so clear with Patrick. Not only was there no physical evidence against him, but it also seemed he had an alibi. On November 1st, there were only a few customers in his pub, but one of them was a professor from Switzerland. The professor had already left Italy but returned 15 days later when he heard that Patrick was accused of a terrible crime, and he gave testimony. He said that during the attack on the girl, Patrick was serving him drinks, and they were chatting about various things. Patrick was released, thrown out onto the street without even an apology, but his place was quickly taken by another suspect. Because, as it turned out, the crime scene hadn't revealed all its secrets. On Meredith's pillow, forensic experts discovered a handprint. This print belonged to Rudy Herman Guedi, a man originally from the Ivory Coast. His fingerprints were found in the system when he applied for a residence permit. The police wanted to talk to Rudy, but he had disappeared. Detectives convinced one of Rudy's friends to contact him via Skype. Rudy shared that he had been on the run for 3 weeks, sleeping on trains and at stations, and that he was currently in Dusseldorf, Germany. Rudy even admitted that he was with Meredith on the night of the murder, but he did not kill her. He added that he knew what Amanda looked like because they had crossed paths before, and that Amanda wasn't at her boyfriend Raphael's house that evening. In fact, Rudy said he didn't even know her boyfriend. Rudy's friend convinced him to surrender to the police. On the way back, the suspect was arrested by German police. On December 6th, Rudy was extradited to Italy amid incredible chaos. The Perugia police were finally able to question the suspect. Rudy said that he and Meredith had crossed paths a few days earlier at a party, and she had invited him over. He arrived at her place on the evening of November 1st. Meredith was upset because she noticed some money missing and suspected Amanda. Once she calmed down, they began to be intimate. A little later, Rudy went to the bathroom. He was wearing headphones. Through the music, he heard the doorbell and a quarrel. Meredith was arguing with someone. In Meredith's room, he noticed a male figure. This man tried to attack Rudy with a knife before running away. Then Rudy went back to Meredith's room and saw that she was seriously wounded. He tried to cover her wounds with towels. Meredith died in his arms. How often do suspects try to pin a crime on some mysterious stranger? Too often. That's why prosecutor Giuliano Menini wasn't going to let Rudy go free without verifying every word and learning everything about him. Rudy had moved to Italy from the Ivory Coast at the age of 4 with his father, leaving his mother behind in his homeland. His relationship with his father was far from ideal. The boy was mostly left to fend for himself. At 15, he was placed in a foster family. The foster parents wanted to give him a better life, but he deceived them, refused to study or work, and was eventually kicked out at 18. He was often caught lying, suspected of petty theft and drug dealing. What he was really good at was basketball. The press quickly labeled him a devil, a monster, presenting as evidence a video he had recorded a few months before the murder. Rudy's DNA matched the DNA found on the toilet paper at the crime scene, on Meredith's purse, on the sleeves of Meredith's jacket, and on the fabric of her bra. It was later revealed that the feces in the toilet were also his, as well as the shoe print. While the shoe print match with Raphael was only partial, the match with Rudy's shoe was 100%. Not to mention, Raphael wore a different shoe size. Against Rudy also spoke the fact that his DNA was found in Meredith's vagina, not semen, but skin cells. Rudy claimed that they had started making love, but the prosecutor did not believe this. It seemed unlike Meredith. Moreover, Meredith had never been to the party where Rudy claimed they met. The prosecutor was convinced Rudy had participated in Meredith's murder. Evidence against Rudy was mounting, while accusations against Raphael appeared to be weakening, but not so fast. On December 18, 2007, about a month and a half after Meredith's death, forensic experts returned to the crime scene. Using luminol, the police managed to reveal the footprints of two barefoot individuals in the second-floor hallway. The forensic police attributed these prints to Raphael and Amanda. The fact that these prints were only found thanks to luminol meant the floor had been thoroughly cleaned. As for the footprint found on the bathroom mat, the police also somehow attributed it to Raphael, despite the fact that he had a deformity on his big toes, making it impossible for that print to be his. In addition, the forensic team found a hook from Meredith's bra with Meredith's and Raphael's DNA. According to the police, this evidence indicated that he participated in the assault and murder of Meredith. The more evidence police found, the stronger the theory of a group murder became. For prosecutor Giuliano Menini, the scenario became increasingly clear. Rudy and Raphael were both captivated by Amanda, willing to do anything for her. On the night of the murder, the three met at Piazza Grimana near the girl's house and went together to the cottage. Meredith started an argument with Amanda over missing money. Amanda got angry, and the fight Rudy mentioned really took place. Then, while Amanda and Raphael secluded themselves in Amanda's bedroom, Rudy tried to seduce Meredith in her room. Meredith refused him, after which Amanda and Raphael intervened to help Rudy achieve his goal. All three stripped Meredith naked. Raphael cut her bra, Rudy held her down and inserted his fingers into her vagina. The young people lost control, couldn't restrain themselves, and killed Meredith. Amanda dealt the final fatal blow, practically slitting the victim's throat. Then, according to Giuliano Menini, Amanda and her friends staged a robbery and threw away the victim's mobile phones. The next morning, Amanda and Raphael returned to clean the crime scene. Only after that did they call the police. From the prosecution's point of view, everything was clear. Each of the three accused had their role. Ideally, the case lacked only eyewitness testimony, and a witness appeared at the end of January 2008. 33-year-old Herkuran Kokomani came forward to the police and said that on the night of Thursday, November 1st, 2007, he was driving past the cottage where Meredith was murdered when he noticed something on the road. At first, he thought it was a black garbage bag. He honked, but the object didn't move. Getting out of the car, he realized it wasn't a bag, but a young man and woman. Both were disoriented. The girl pulled a knife from her bag and threatened Herkuran, demanding that he leave. Another young man appeared. The girl ordered both companions to hide their faces, but it was too late. Herkuran recognized Rudy because he had seen him in town. He left, and only when he saw the news about Meredith's murder did he identify the young man and woman as Amanda and Raphael. He was afraid to go to the police until he understood how important his testimony was. But he was not the only one holding vital information. In early February 2008, homeless man Antonio Curatolo reported that on November 1st at 9:30 p.m., he was at Piazza Grimana near the girl's house when he saw Raphael and Amanda. The young couple was deeply engrossed in each other, oblivious to everything around them. Antonio saw them again around midnight in the square when he was about to go sleep in the park. This was a breakthrough for the investigation. Two witnesses contradicted the alibi of the couple and linked them to the crime scene. This time, the investigation was truly complete. In October 2008, Rudy's trial took place separately from the other defendants for several reasons. First of all, he and his lawyers feared that Raphael and Amanda would team up and testify against him. Additionally, the lawyers wanted the trial to proceed under an expedited procedure. In Italy, lawyers can request counter-examinations and re-examinations of evidence as many times as they want. An expedited trial means that lawyers waive the right to request counter-examinations, which saves time and speeds up the verdict. The benefit for the defendant is that if found guilty, the sentence is reduced by 1/3. The prosecutor did not oppose the expedited trial either, confident that once Rudy was convicted, he would become more cooperative, especially if offered a reduced sentence. On October 28th, Rudy was sentenced to 30 years for gang rape and murder. He appealed, and the sentence was reduced to 24 years. Thanks to the expedited trial, he will serve only 2/3 of the term, that is, 16 years. So, Rudy's case was clear, but the trial everyone was really waiting for was the one against the couple. It began in Perugia on January 16, 2009. Amanda and Raphael were tried together. This was just the first stage of a long legal marathon. Journalists from all over the world besieged the city. Millions of people, including celebrities, followed the heart-stopping trial. Among the defenders and supporters was even Donald Trump. In an interview, he said he wouldn't be who he is today if he didn't understand people. And he was convinced Amanda was innocent. Guilty only of foolish things, she said under police pressure. The trial lasted 10 months. The court examined evidence and witnesses one by one. Although lawyers have the right to request counter-expertises to verify evidence, in this controversial and high-profile case, the judge did not allow it. According to the judge, there was already enough evidence, and additional expert reports were unnecessary. Presenting the evidence, prosecutor Giuliano Menini focused on the defendant's personalities. He painted a terrible portrait based partly on handwriting analysis. Regarding Amanda, the expert found narcissism, irritability, manipulativeness, theatricality, and aggression. Raphael, on the contrary, showed dependent traits, passive, willing to take on unpleasant tasks to gain approval. In this case from Amanda, Menini mentioned the difficult relationship between Amanda and Meredith. He described Amanda as an overly sexually uninhibited girl, the exact opposite of the wise and modest Meredith. According to the prosecutor, Amanda felt morally insulted by Meredith and took the opportunity to take revenge that night. 3 depraved young people attacked the girl who dared to express her opinion. It was a sexual game gone wrong in which they immobilized, raped, and slit Meredith's throat. This was the prosecutor's conclusion. It's incredible that the Italian judicial system focuses more on character than on facts. In the end, the defendants were found guilty. The prosecutor demanded life imprisonment for both, but Amanda was sentenced to 26 years and Raphael to 25 years. Amanda's sentence was longer due to a defamatory accusation she made against her boss, the pub owner, Patrick. The convicted immediately appealed, and while awaiting the second round, the young people had to adjust to life in prison. Amanda tried to continue her studies and stay sane, while Raphael fell into depression and experienced health problems. The appeal process began in Perugia on November 24, 2010. The key difference in this trial was that the defense lawyers immediately demanded a re-examination of all the evidence. The judge agreed, and this changed the entire scenario painted by the prosecutor. The main piece of evidence was a knife found in Raphael's house with Meredith's and Amanda's DNA on it. It was presented as the murder weapon, but independent experts disagreed, stating there was not enough DNA on the blade to definitively say it belonged to Meredith. Amanda's DNA on the handle was explained by her relationship with Raphael. At the defense's request, a forensic expert compared Meredith's fatal wound to the knife and noticed bruising around the wound caused by the hand holding the knife. Since the blade was 18 centimeters long, such a deep stab would have gone through Meredith's neck completely, which it didn't. Therefore, the knife could not have been the murder weapon. How did Meredith's DNA get on the knife then? Crime scene investigators didn't always change gloves when touching different objects, passed items between each other, dropped things on the floor, and stored evidence in unsealed bags. Independent experts were outraged by the way the evidence was collected and tested, declaring it compromised and contaminated, thus unusable. The same, even more so, applied to Raphael's DNA found on the clasp of Meredith's bra. The retesting revealed not only Raphael's DNA, but also DNA from several unknown men. Unlike Rudy's DNA, which was found on the fabric of the girl's underwear, Raphael's DNA was only on the clasp. But how could someone touch the clasp without touching the bra's fabric? Moreover, the investigators photographed the clasp on November 2, 2007, the day Meredith's body was discovered, but left it in place. They only picked it up a month and a half later, and not from the same spot, but a meter away under a carpet. Thus, what once seemed irrefutable evidence turned out to be nonsense. In the end, these pieces of evidence were glaring investigative errors. This was a true turning point. Without the main evidence, the knife and the clasp, proving Raphael and Amanda's presence at the crime scene, became impossible. Furthermore, it was simply unbelievable that 3 people could kill the girl after beating and raping her, yet no hair, clothing fibers, blood, or fingerprints of Amanda and Raphael were found in Meredith's room. Amanda's DNA was completely absent from the crime scene. Apparently, Amanda controlled the murder from the neighboring room. The prosecutor claimed Amanda and Raphael returned the morning after the murder to clean the room. But there were plenty of Rudy's fingerprints and DNA left. This would mean Amanda and Raphael selectively wiped only their DNA but left Rudy's untouched. In other words, they could somehow see DNA and distinguish theirs from Rudy's, which is obviously impossible. Most likely, Rudy sneaked into the house that evening, possibly just to rob the girls. Meredith came home too early because she had to attend university early the next day. Or perhaps Rudy deliberately waited for the attractive girl at her home, knowing that her neighbors would be away for the holiday evening. As for key witnesses, their testimonies fell apart during cross-examination. They could no longer confidently identify the suspects or claim they saw them on the day of the murder. Further supporting Amanda and Raphael's innocence was the fact that they never testified against each other, never blamed one another, and never tried to shift the blame, which almost always happens in such cases. Considering all the facts, on October 3, 2011, after 4 years in custody, Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito were acquitted. The public reaction was starkly divided. Italians surrounded the courthouse, whistling and shouting, "Murderers!" They demanded the death penalty not only for Amanda and Rafael, but also for their lawyers. Police had to intervene to protect them. On the same day, Amanda flew to Seattle, where she was welcomed as a heroine. Rafael returned to his hometown in southern Italy with his family, trying to enjoy a quiet life away from the cameras. Both Amanda and Rafael wrote books recounting their experience. They were immediately accused of profiting from Meredith's death, but Amanda's father explained that nearly all the $4 million Amanda earned from the book went to paying off debts the family had incurred to get her out of prison. However, they hardly had time to truly enjoy their freedom. Convinced of their position, in February 2012, the Attorney General appealed to the court in Rome to annul the appeal trial, and his request was granted. The Supreme Court of Italy overturned the acquittal. A new trial began in Florence in 2013. Amanda decided to stay in Seattle and only Rafael attended. No new evidence emerged for the prosecution. The same issues, the knife and the bra clasp, were debated repeatedly. At the beginning of 2014, Amanda and Rafael were again found guilty and sentenced to 28.5 and 25 years respectively. Rafael's passport was confiscated, but he was not sent to prison immediately because they promptly filed a cassation appeal. The cassation hearing started 8 years after Meredith's murder. This was essentially their last chance. Remarkably, several contradictory verdicts had been issued before, all based on the same evidence. Once again, the defense succeeded in casting doubt on the reliability of the forensic tests, witness statements, and even the police work. Doubts favored the accused. On March 27, 2015, the court acquitted the pair. From that moment, the verdict was final. Rudy is the only one convicted for Meredith's murder. He was released in November 2021 after serving 13 of 16 years. Rudy spent just over 2 years free when, in December 2023, his 23-year-old girlfriend accused him of domestic violence. He was ordered to stay away from her and was fitted with an ankle monitor. Rafael commented that he hadn't followed Rudy's life, but given recent events, it was clear he hadn't changed much. Rafael himself works as a software developer in Milan and appears as a true crime expert on TV shows in Italy. He received no compensation for the 4 years he spent in prison. Amanda Knox works as a journalist, hosts a podcast, and advocates for the wrongly convicted in her hometown, Seattle. She is married and a mother of 2. Amanda admits she struggles between wanting to clear her name and just disappear. On one hand, she often appears on shows to convince people she was innocent. On the other, she wishes people would simply forget her. Every event in her life is scrutinized, and people compare her life to what Meredith's could have been. After Amanda's daughter was born, some even wished death upon the child, saying it would make Amanda understand what Meredith's mother felt, even though Amanda had been acquitted years before. Many still believe in her guilt. Amanda Knox is undeniably guilty of ruining the life of her boss, Patrick, a pub owner. After her false accusation, he never cleared his name and had to leave Italy. Amanda never apologized to him. But is Amanda truly guilty of Meredith's murder? As the judge who made the final decision said, it's not that evidence is entirely lacking, but it is insufficient to convict anyone. This high-profile case became known as the Amanda Knox case, and everyone seemed to forget the victim, a young woman brutally murdered while her neighbors were away celebrating. Meredith was almost erased from her own story. Many believe the case drew so much attention because both girls were incredibly beautiful, intelligent, and popular, seemingly standing on opposite sides of good and evil. This remarkable case, with evidence clearly pointing to the killer's conviction, still leaves the unsettling feeling that justice was not served. At least the final verdict allowed Meredith Kircher's family to move past the press and court proceedings and quietly mourn their loss. The province of British Columbia, on Canada's west coast, is known for its stunning scenery and unparalleled natural beauty. Every summer, tourists and locals alike connect with nature by setting up tents in many of the province's parks. Some paths have been well-trodden for years, while others, like Wells Gray Provincial Park, remain more remote. Located about 5 hours northeast of Vancouver, Wells Gray is a vast and nearly uninhabited wilderness. In the early 1980s, this quiet region became the backdrop for one of Canada's most shocking crimes. On August 2nd, 1982, Bob and Jackie Johnson, 44-year-old Bob and his 41-year-old wife Jackie, set out from their home in Kelowna with their two daughters, 13-year-old Janet and 11-year-old Karen, for a 2-week vacation in Wellsgray Park. Shortly after their arrival, they were joined by Jackie's parents, 66-year-old George Bentley and 59-year-old Edith Bentley, who came in their brand new 1981 Ford Camper Special. The family loved camping in the wild, but this was their first time visiting Wellsgray. They had heard it was breathtaking and wanted to experience it together. What was supposed to be a beautiful 3-generation family vacation in a scenic park was shattered by a heartless predator who decided to bring his vile fantasies about young girls to life. When Bob Johnson failed to show up for work on August 16th, 2 weeks after setting out on vacation, his colleagues and friends became alarmed. In 25 years, he had never missed a day of work without a valid reason, let alone without notifying anyone. After making a few phone calls, his co-workers discovered that the entire family had not returned from their camping trip. At first, they assumed the family may have experienced car trouble or had simply been unable to contact anyone from the remote wilderness. But after waiting a week with no news, on August 23, 1982, the family's friends reported them missing to the RCMP. A massive search operation began in Wellsgray Provincial Park. However, as the days passed one after another, the hope of finding the family faded more and more into the distance. On September 12th, after 3 weeks of fruitless searching, a mushroom forager contacted the police with chilling news. Deep in the forest, he had discovered a burned-out vehicle. The license plates confirmed it belonged to the Johnson family. When officers approached the vehicle, what they saw shocked even the most seasoned investigators. On the back seat were the charred bones of several individuals, but it was when they managed to pry open the trunk that even hardened detectives recoiled. The skeletal remains of children lay inside. While only dental records would confirm their identities, police were now almost certain they had found all 6 missing family members. As forensic teams continued to comb the area, more clues emerged. Near a road, they discovered freshly cut branches, clearly placed to conceal a makeshift path leading to where the vehicle had been dumped. Inside the vehicle, they also found a bloody axe handle. It was obvious someone had gone to great lengths to hide the car deep in the woods, away from any obvious route, suggesting a local perpetrator familiar with the terrain. The positioning of the bodies led investigators to believe that the victims had not died in the fire. They appeared to have been placed there. This was confirmed when a bullet hole was discovered in a partially intact skull. The projectile matched a .22 caliber round. The authorities now knew they were dealing with one of Canada's worst mass murders. But one key element was still missing: the Bentley's trailer. If they could locate the trailer, they might find the killer. In parallel, police canvassed the local area door to door, asking if anyone had seen any of the 6 missing family members. Within a week, this effort paid off. A park employee reported spotting a similar trailer parked at Old Bear Creek prison site, a remote campground deep in the woods. Investigators rushed to the site. The clearing was a known spot for campers. As they searched the area, they quickly spotted camp cookware, matching that seen in photos of the Johnson family. In a nearby spring, they found beer bottles, neatly placed to keep them cold. The brand matched Bob Johnson's known preference. 2 sharpened sticks were found by the fire pit, likely used by the girls to roast mushrooms. All evidence suggested the family had been camping peacefully at Bear Creek until something horrific happened. And then came the next chilling discovery: a spent .22 caliber shell casing. A closer sweep turned up 5 more. Now certain Bear Creek was the murder scene, police chose not to disclose this to the media. Around the same time, information surfaced about witnesses who may have seen the missing trailer. Police received a tip from a man who claimed he had followed a camper, matching the description to a gas station in North Battleford, Saskatchewan. 2 disheveled men exited the vehicle and walked into a nearby diner. Investigators pursuing this lead found other witnesses who confirmed seeing the Ford and 2 men with French accents. Detectives believed that they were now following their most promising lead. They brought in a sketch artist and produced composite images of 2 men in their early 20s who spoke with French-Canadian accents. Photos of the men and the vehicle were distributed to the media nationwide, and soon investigators were overwhelmed by a flood of phone calls. The volume of tips convinced police they were on the right track. Someone was indeed traveling east in the stolen camper, heading toward the Ontario-Quebec border. However, as time passed, The number of calls began to decline, and the Ford still hadn't been located. In an effort to jog witnesses' memories, police recreated George and Edith Bentley's trailer in exact detail, down to the aluminum boat strapped to the roof, and on May 9, 1983, began a tour from British Columbia to Quebec. Before arriving in each town, police held press conferences, hoping someone would recognize the Ford and recall something useful. They received over 1,300 calls, but none led to a breakthrough. Police announced a $7,500 reward, printed 10,000 flyers, and sent them to other police departments and post offices across North America. Additionally, they agreed to help a TV crew shoot a documentary about the case on location in Bear Creek. Finally, in September, a promising tip came in, the most significant one in months. A local mechanic in Ontario called the police and said he had repainted the Ford camper for two young men. Not only that, the men had a .22 caliber rifle they wanted to get rid of. The mechanic said the pair were headed to Detroit, Michigan. But before investigators could alert their U.S. counterparts, the case took an unexpected turn. On October 18, 1983, 14 months after the murders in Wells Gray Park, two park rangers discovered a burned-out Ford camper less than 15 kilometers from the crime scene. It was George and Edith Bentley's trailer. It had been deliberately hidden in such a way that no helicopter flying overhead could have spotted it. The trailer had been torched using an accelerant, likely gasoline mixed with another substance. Detectives were stunned to realize they had been chasing a false lead all along. The camper had never left the park, and now all the suspect sketches were useless. A year of investigation had just gone up in smoke, and they had to start over from square one. The very next morning, detectives and forensic experts returned to the park to search for fresh evidence. The condition of the vehicle confirmed not only that the family had met a violent end, but also that a shooting had taken place. In the driver's door, investigators found a bullet hole consistent with a .22 caliber round, though they chose not to reveal this detail to the press. At the time, they had no idea this decision would eventually help them crack the case. Despite the trailer being completely destroyed by fire, one fact was undeniable. The person who had hidden it knew the area extremely well. So in October 1983, the police decided to once again go door to door and speak with every local resident, this time in greater detail. After 2 weeks of canvassing, they uncovered something intriguing. While talking to one couple, the wife casually mentioned something a man named Dave had said. He'd asked about how to transfer vehicle ownership and what to do about a bullet hole in a car door. The Dave she was referring to was 24-year-old David William Shearing. He had since moved away from the Wells Gray area, but at the time of the crime, he had been living in his parents' home not far from the park. Police had spoken to him once before, and at the time, his answers hadn't raised any red flags. While police were trying to track Shearing down, they received another tip. A caller told them that back in 1980, Shearing had hit someone with his car on a road in Wells Gray Park and then fled the scene. The police discovered that Shearing was now living in Tumbler Ridge, about 600 kilometers from Wells Gray. Constable Ron German of Tumbler Ridge was already familiar with Shearing. He had first encountered him 2 months earlier when he stopped Shearing and two of his friends late at night. German had asked about the expensive tools in Shearing's car, and Shearing claimed they were his and that he was just coming back from work. However, the very next morning, 2 local companies contacted German to report break-ins and the theft of tools valued at $40,000. The very same tools German had seen in Shearing's car. As a result, Shearing was released under the condition that he regularly report his whereabouts to law enforcement. On November 16, 1983, German received a call from investigators working the Wells Gray family murder case. They informed him that the petty thief he had been monitoring, David Shearing, was now a suspect in one of Canada's most horrifying crimes. But they asked German not to arrest Shearing for the murders. Doing so would ruin their one advantage, the element of surprise. During the 2-hour drive to the interview, Shearing would have plenty of time to rehearse a story if he suspected anything. With no hard evidence against him, the investigators' only hope was to catch him off guard and secure a confession. So the next morning, Constable German approached Shearing on the street and casually told him that some investigators in Dawson Creek wanted to ask him a few questions about another matter. He assured Shearing that he was not under arrest, and Shearing agreed to get into the car and go to Dawson Creek voluntarily. Upon arrival, the unsuspecting Shearing was handed over to Sergeant Mike Eastham and Constable Ken Liebel. The investigators knew that the moment a lawyer showed up, Shearing would likely go silent. So despite having no physical evidence, they were determined to get a confession. Hoping to catch him off guard, Eastham began the interview by questioning Shearing about a different crime, the hit-and-run incident. Immediately, the detectives noticed a visible sense of relief wash over Shearing's face, as if he were thinking, "That's all?" Moments earlier, he had appeared anxious, sweating and shifting his eyes nervously. But now, he relaxed and readily admitted to the hit and run. He seemed confident that he could confess to the lesser crime and then go home. Then suddenly, the conversation shifted to the main investigation. When asked if he had heard about the murders, Shearing acknowledged he had. After all, the entire country knew about the case. But when Sergeant Eastham casually asked if he knew where the murders had taken place, Shearing responded, "Wasn't it Bear Creek?" That was the slip. Only the killer could have known the location, as Bear Creek had never been released to the media. Trying to seem innocent, Shearing had just made a critical mistake. The investigator's tone became more direct and accusatory, and Shearing began to unravel. His nervousness returned, and under pressure, his defense collapsed. Finally, he broke down, sobbing, and confessed to the murders. Shearing told them he attacked the adults while they were sitting around the campfire, then went after the girls, who were in the tent. He placed the bodies in their car and drove it in the middle of the night to a mountainside, where he set it ablaze using 5 cans of gasoline. He then cleaned up the campsite and towed the trailer to his parents' home, later burning it too when he realized how difficult it would be to re-register it. Shearing insisted the motive was robbery. He claimed he wanted to take the family's car, camper, and boat. But investigators already suspected his true motive was something far more disturbing. Following his confession, Shearing led investigators back to the crime scene in Wells Gray and reenacted the events. He also brought them to his parents' home, where he had hidden numerous belongings from the Johnson and Bentley families, including the .22 caliber rifle. On April 16, 1984, the perpetrator appeared in court and pleaded guilty. The next day, Judge McKay sentenced David Shearing to 6 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole for 25 years. This was the maximum possible sentence for a second-degree murder, and the first time in Canadian history that such a sentence had been handed down. However, many were surprised that the sentences were concurrent, meaning Shearing would still be eligible for parole. He did not contest the verdict. The case was closed, but Sergeant Eastham, who had worked on it for almost 2 years, simply could not believe that Shearing had taken so many lives just for a robbery. Before the trial, he made a deal with the accused. Once the trial was over, he wanted to hear the truth from Shearing. He also hinted to him that he would be writing a report on his compliance with parole conditions, which would affect Shearing throughout his imprisonment. After the guilty verdict was delivered, RCMP Sergeant Mike Eastham said to Shearing, "You know why I'm here, David. I think you did something to those girls before you killed them. You told me some time ago that you'd consider telling me the whole truth after the verdict. Well, now I'm here to hear the whole story, and I won't accept no as an answer, David." And Shearing told Eastham what really happened. He had noticed Janet and Karen and decided to capture them, even if it meant killing their parents and grandparents. Shearing said he saw the family when they set up camp and spent several days spying on them and fantasizing about the girls. At dusk on August 10, 1982, he approached the camp with a rifle and cold-bloodedly shot Bob, then Jackie, George, and Edith. The girls were already inside the tent, getting ready for bed. Shearing said he looked inside and told them that a dangerous biker gang was nearby and that their parents had gone for help. While the girls stayed in the tent, he moved their parents and grandparents to the back seat of the car and covered them with a blanket. Then he entered the tent where the defenseless girls remained. The man put them in the car where the bodies lay and drove to a fishing cabin on the Clearwater River. Shearing confessed to Eastham that Janet and Karen remained alive for about a week, staying with him both in the small fishing cabin on the river and in his house. All the while, he exploited the fact that they were completely under his control. The saddest part is that at one point the girls could have been discovered and saved. Prisoners from the local jail were allowed to fish in the river. A prison guard who supervised them came to the cabin to warn Shearing not to worry about them just at the time when the girls were there. But during the conversation, Shearing hid the sisters behind the door and ordered them to be quiet. The guard noticed nothing unusual and left. Fearing another unexpected encounter, Shearing moved the girls to his family's farm, where their ordeal continued. Unfortunately, having gotten everything he wanted, Schering had no intention of letting the sisters go. On August 16th, he took Karen into the woods and used his weapon again. The next day, he did the same with the older sister, Janet. Then he moved them to their parents' hidden car, drove to a remote location, and set the vehicle on fire. To verify this story, Eastham found the very guard. The guard recalled the encounter exactly as Schering had described it. Then RCMP Constable Ken Leibel trekked through dense brush to the fishing cabin. Schering told Leibel that he had scratched his initials on the wall there. The constable did indeed find them next to other letters, JJ, which corresponded to the initials of 13-year-old Janet Jackson. 25 years later, the constable said in an interview, "That's how close everyone was to them. If not for cruel fate, those wonderful little girls would be alive today." One of the most mysterious cases in the criminal history of France began on March 21, 1991, when Jean-Louis Turquin called the police to report the disappearance of his 7-year-old son, Charles-Edouard Turquin. The father and son lived in a large mansion in Nice. The boy had his own habits. For example, he had a puppy and would feed it early in the morning before breakfast with his grandparents, whose house was nearby. That morning, not finding his son in bed, Jean-Louis assumed that the boy had woken up and, without making any noise so as not to disturb his father, had run off to his puppy. But the grandparents told him they had not seen the boy. The father then went to check his son's favorite garden, but Charles-Edouard was not there either. None of the boy's belongings were missing, neither clothes nor toys. In other words, the boy had disappeared wearing only his pajamas. The father quickly called the police. The man told the arriving police officers that he and his wife were both veterinarians. The couple had separated, although they had not yet finalized their divorce. Their son continued living with his father in a large house with 22 rooms, arranged like an English manor. The previous day, the boy had spent time with his mother. She brought him home in the evening, and Charles-Edouard and Jean-Louis went to bed not very late. Charles-Edouard slept with his father in a small room with 2 single beds placed side by side. After his parents' separation, he had refused to sleep in the children's room, saying it was too dark and that he didn't like it. The child often got up at night to use the bathroom, so according to Jean-Louis, he didn't realize until morning that his son had disappeared. The police called in handlers with search dogs. The dogs led the handlers from the bedroom to the gate of the house, after which the boy's trail disappeared. The logical conclusion was that Charles-Edouard had walked to the gate either on his own or accompanied by someone, after which he was placed in a car and taken away. The police didn't know how to classify the case. They doubted it was a kidnapping. There was no ransom demand and no signs of forced entry. But there were no leads to find the child either. No one in the neighborhood had heard or seen anything, even though it was a densely populated area. It seemed strange that no one had noticed a 7-year-old child at such a late hour. The investigation quickly focused on the boy's parents because both of them were behaving extremely oddly. The couple had not yet finalized their divorce, and their separation was very contentious. The police concluded that one of the parents might have kidnapped the child to gain leverage over the other. Michelle Turquin immediately accused Jean-Louis. She believed that the father had hidden their son somewhere to spite her, since he was the last one to see the boy. Moreover, just a few minutes after the search for the 7-year-old had begun, Jean-Louis announced that he had work that couldn't be canceled and that he needed to leave. A curious reaction. For his part, the father insisted that Michelle might have hidden the child out of fear of losing custody. However, it was unlikely that she was truly afraid of that. She rarely spent time with her son and often admitted to friends that she didn't know what to talk to him about. Right after Charles-Edouard's disappearance, she calmly went shopping. Despite her seemingly indifferent behavior, Michelle had an alibi. Having moved out of the family home a month earlier, she was staying with friends several dozen kilometers from Nice. She had spent the entire evening with them, and the friends confirmed her alibi. For this reason, the list of suspects quickly narrowed down to one person, Jean-Louis. 2 days after the boy's disappearance, the father was taken into custody. The police officers hoped to get a quick confession out of him, but they realized they had miscalculated. Even under arrest, Jean-Louis remained composed. He calmly told the detectives that he had expected to be arrested, that it was normal during an investigation, and he completely understood. However, he emphasized that this did not mean he was guilty of anything. The man was released and allowed to return home. Jean-Louis did everything he could to find his missing son. He put up posters around the city with photographs of the boy, offering a reward of 100,000 francs for any information that could help find him. But as the days went by, the detectives increasingly began to consider the possibility that Charles-Edouard had not simply been kidnapped but murdered. The father remained the sole suspect. Wiretapping his phone yielded no useful results. The police found themselves at a dead end, unsure of what more they could do. Michelle had no doubt that her husband had done something to their son, and she told herself that she had to extract a confession from him at any cost. She shared her plan with the police, and they suggested that she try to get Jean-Louis to talk while secretly recording him. They advised her to purchase a small Sony tape recorder and set a trap for her husband. Michelle made an appointment to see Jean-Louis at his office. She dressed as if she were going on a date. When she entered his office, she placed her handbag, with the recorder inside, close to them and began to put her plan into action. Michelle flirted with her husband, sat on his lap, and tried to seduce him in every way she could. She knew very well that this wouldn't be difficult. Jean-Louis, who had always been madly in love with her, would not be able to resist his feelings. And it was during their intimate games that Michelle demanded her husband tell her what he had done with the boy. She insisted, pressured him. The man told her what she wanted to hear. He confessed to killing their son. Jean-Louis told Michelle how he first gave the child a sleeping pill that he used in his veterinary practice. He didn't want to deal with blood, so he strangled Charles-Edouard with a tie in the bedroom and disposed of the body in the mountains. Michelle tried to find out exactly where the boy was buried, but her husband answered vaguely, giving only a rough description of the place that became Charles-Edouard's final resting spot. Jean-Louis told his wife she shouldn't think about it anymore because it was all in the past now. He said that Charles-Edouard had been a parasite, an obstacle to their love. But now, once Michelle returned home, they could have another child. After leaving Jean-Louis' office, Michelle told a friend about her unexpected visit and about the confession she had forced out of him. The friend immediately told Jean-Louis that he understood it was all a made-up story, but warned him he would pay dearly for this lie. He was absolutely right. 1 week later, on May 13, 1991, Jean-Louis was arrested. The man tried to deny that he had confessed to his wife about the murder, but when he was given a tape to listen to, a recording of his own voice, he admitted that he had said all those horrible things. However, he insisted they were not true. According to him, it was a kind of twisted role-playing game that his wife had dragged him into, and she had pressured him into giving those answers. She wanted him to confess, and so he did. In short, his defense boiled down to this: I confessed so that she would come back home to me. Indeed, what better way to convince a woman to return to her husband than by telling her you murdered their child? Jean-Louis was charged with the abduction and murder of Charles-Edouard. However, the taped confession seemed insufficient to detectives to secure a conviction. Therefore, they set out to uncover everything they could about Jean-Louis' life in order to understand how he could have committed such a horrific crime. Jean-Louis was born into a modest but loving family. He and his sister remembered their happy childhood with great fondness. Unfortunately, when Jean-Louis was 18 years old, both his father and mother passed away within just a few months of each other. As a result, Jean-Louis took on the responsibility of raising his sister. He had already been a serious, disciplined, and intelligent boy, but having to care for his sister made him even more determined and focused. His classmates described him as a very hardworking and mature person in many ways. Perhaps that's why he was so drawn to Michelle. She had just started her first year at veterinary school when Jean-Louis was already in his fourth year. There was something childlike and naive about her behavior. She was remarkably shy. This touched Jean-Louis, and he felt a strong urge to protect her. It was the first love for both of them. For Jean-Louis, Michelle became the woman of his life. His love eventually grew into an obsession. In 1975, the young couple got married. However, in many ways, they were not a typical couple. This thought first crossed the minds of their mutual friends when Jean-Louis opened a veterinary clinic in Nice, while Michelle began working as a veterinarian in Colombes, near Paris. In other words, the couple was separated by 950 kilometers. They lived like this for 6 years, and it was only in 1981 that Michelle joined her husband in Nice, opening her own clinic next door to his. Business was booming. 2 veterinarians in Nice, a city full of ladies with little dogs. Jean-Louis worked day and night, sometimes 7 days a week, but his hard work allowed the family to live lavishly. Jean-Louis bought a mansion with a swimming pool for 10 million francs, about 1.5 million euros, drove a Rolls-Royce, and the couple dined at the finest restaurants. However, all their relatives insisted that by that time, the marriage had already started to crack. Michelle had affairs with men who were complete opposites of her husband. Simply put, with marginal figures. One of them was a former dancer from America, Moise Brettelstein. Having lived a bohemian life on the Riviera for some time, he was now begging on the streets of Old Nice. He met Michelle when he brought his dog into her office. Jean-Louis found out about his wife's affair and decided to take a desperate step. Since it is said that circumcised lovers give their partners more pleasure, he performed the circumcision procedure on himself in his own office. He was ready to do anything to keep his wife. It was against this backdrop that Michelle found out in 1982 that she was pregnant. Jean-Louis jumped for joy because he had always dreamed of becoming a father. However, Michelle wanted to terminate the pregnancy, claiming that childbirth was painful and she would gain extra weight. Jean-Louis tried to convince her, but after exhausting all arguments against abortion, he threatened Michelle, saying he would kill her if she went through with it. He regretted his words, but Michelle was frightened and agreed to keep the baby. However, she promised to leave the family after the baby was born. Jean-Louis did not argue, as he believed that once she gave birth, she would change her mind. The man hoped that life would improve, but he was mistaken. The sad truth was that his wife no longer loved him, nor did she love the child she was expecting. Michelle complained to her friends about her unplanned pregnancy, describing it as if a cancerous tumor was growing inside her. Little Charles Edward was born in 1982. Many years later, Michelle claimed that when he was born, she of course loved him, but after childbirth she rejected the boy. Since the father worked a lot, the child was raised by his maternal grandparents, who lived next door to the mansion. Jean-Louis and Michelle, strangely enough, continued living together, or rather, in the same house. The mansion was so huge that they could live in it, go about their business, and never cross paths. Charles Edward grew up in a family where the parents didn't even have dinner together. They lived parallel lives with the little boy at the center. Is it any wonder that he grew up to be a very sensitive, shy, and melancholic boy, and very intelligent? At 7, he seemed quite mature, was fascinated by nature and insects, and dreamed of becoming an entomologist. The situation in the family tormented him, and he tried to bring his parents closer with gentle gestures. In his garden near the house, he grew beans, which his father adored, and strawberries, which his mother loved. This was his way of reconciling them, of bringing his parents together through their favorite things. Jean-Louis was irritated that Charles Edward was growing up so sensitive. To toughen up the boy, he strangled a chicken in front of him that his son had tamed. Furthermore, Jean-Louis told his son that he shouldn't love his mother because she had wanted to kill him when he was in her womb. Both the father and the mother used their son in their games to hurt the other. As a result of their conflict, the boy began to have developmental problems, such as dyslexia and involuntary urination. In 1991, after another quarrel, Michelle made the final decision to move in with friends and filed for divorce. But before leaving, she angrily told her husband that he was not the father of their son. Jean-Louis was stunned. A paternity test confirmed that he was indeed not the boy's father. Jean-Louis suspected that the father was Moise, Michelle's lover. The man struggled with the breakup and the news about his son, sending Michelle letters in which he begged her to come back home, but she refused to even hear about it. The day before the child's disappearance, he sent Michelle a telegram with a hidden threat of returning home. Otherwise, serious, irreversible events might occur. She didn't return, and at 7:30 in the morning, Jean-Louis called the police to report that Charles Edward had disappeared. According to the investigation, when Jean-Louis found out that he was not the boy's father, he had a motive to get rid of the child. After Michelle's confession, the police dedicated all their efforts to finding the child's grave. Based on the description provided by Jean-Louis, it was decided to search in Lucéram. For 4 days, 100 people combed through 8,000 hectares of forest, but they were unable to find a spot with freshly dug earth. It was suggested that Jean-Louis might not have buried the child. Since the man was a veterinarian, he had access to incineration plants and could have cremated the boy. However, searches at the local incineration plants also yielded no results. 9 months later, Jean-Louis was released from custody. The man went on a hunger strike and took it so far that he endangered his own life, which led to his release on bail. He returned home, and while going through some belongings, he found Michelle's diary with intriguing contents. His wife mentioned someone named Yosef, who was learning to read Hebrew and showing progress. She also wrote about purchasing a house in Tel Aviv. Jean-Louis immediately became suspicious and decided that Yosef must be Charles Edward. Convinced that his son was alive, he hired a private detective to observe his wife. Jean-Louis unexpectedly discovered that his wife had traveled to Israel several times, Although she had claimed to be in Great Britain, he sent the private detective to Israel, to Ashdod, where Michelle had bought a house. The detective went from door to door, visited shops, and showed people photos of Michelle and the boy. He managed to uncover something. 2 hairdressers stated that they had seen Michelle with a boy who resembled Charles Edward. Jean-Louis's trial was scheduled for March 1994, but due to a new development in the case, it was postponed. The man and his lawyers loudly proclaimed that the boy had not died, but was living and growing up in Israel. The police were forced to conduct an additional investigation to confirm or refute this information, which significantly delayed the date of the trial. Then 2 months after the postponement, on December 24, 1993, Moïse, Michelle's lover, passed away. He died in Nice under very mysterious circumstances. His body was pulled from the water while wearing an extremely heavy diving suit, making it impossible to swim in. The man's body was covered in bruises. The police were unable to determine what had happened to him. Finally, on March 17, 1997, the trial began because the police had been unable to confirm that Charles Edward was living in Israel. Michelle answered all police questions by stating that she had not kidnapped the child, and whatever she had done in Israel was, essentially, her own business and nobody else's concern. Thus, Jean-Louis was put on trial despite the lack of a body, physical evidence, or witnesses to the crime. The only thing the prosecution had was the man's confession, recorded on tape at a very delicate moment. Michelle, of course, attended the trial. She appeared to be depressed, but no more than that. It was as though her thoughts were somewhere far away. In essence, both parents showed no sorrow, as if the child had never existed and he had faded from their memory. When the jury listened to the tape of the man's confession, a dead silence filled the courtroom. It provoked mixed thoughts and emotions. Some admired Michelle for agreeing to seduce her hateful husband in the name of truth. Others believed that the woman had simply manipulated Jean-Louis into saying the words she wanted to hear, taking advantage of his dependence on her. In order to better understand what might have happened that night in the family's home, the judge made a rather unusual decision to transport all members of the court to the scene of the incident, namely to the family mansion, so that everyone could see with their own eyes the house and the bedroom from which the child had disappeared. As the jurors later admitted, this trip helped tip the scales in favor of the prosecution's version of events. Before the visit, they had imagined a spacious bedroom with 2 beds, but after seeing the actual room, they realized that the father and son had slept in a tiny room with 2 single beds pushed together. The jurors were puzzled, wondering how Charles Edward could have left the room without his father noticing. To turn the situation in his favor, the man's lawyers naturally invited hairdressers from Israel. They claimed to have seen Michelle with a child who was 8 years old. However, during cross-examination, the prosecutor immediately asked them how the child could have been 8 years old when at that time he was already 12. Overall, the witnesses' testimonies ended up harming Jean-Louis, as they made him the subject of ridicule. The man was found guilty. The prosecutor demanded a life sentence, believing that the deliberate murder of a child was the most horrific crime. However, Jean-Louis was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But this was far from the end of the story. After the verdict was rendered, the case went quiet for several years. But in 2003, a new chapter unfolded. A 45-year-old prisoner, convicted of murder, wrote a letter to Jean-Louis's lawyer. He claimed that another inmate had confessed to him how, along with an accomplice, they had accidentally run over the boy while fleeing after a robbery in a stolen car late at night. The boy, wearing pajamas, had been on the road in the middle of the night. The men put the body in the car and disposed of it at a cement plant near Marseille. However, this informant, who wrote the letter to the lawyer, refused to reveal the name of the potential killer and demanded to be released from prison first. The French authorities, however, did not succumb to the blackmail. And despite the informant having previously assisted the police in solving a double murder, he was denied his release. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison for refusing to provide testimony that could have exonerated an innocent person. Meanwhile, Jean-Louis quietly served his sentence in prison. He stood firm in his beliefs, never admitted to anything he hadn't done, and demonstrated exemplary behavior. But also, he found new love. Nadine Shaber, a dance teacher and mother of 3, learned about the court case involving Jean-Louis through the media, and his story deeply touched her. She believed in his innocence and obtained permission to visit the prisoner. Nadine went to visit Jean-Louis, and from that moment on, she visited him every weekend for several years. When Jean-Louis proposed to her, she happily accepted. The couple married in prison, Then, in March 2006, 56-year-old Jean-Louis was released. He had spent almost 10 years in prison after the verdict. Waiting for him outside the prison gates were Nadine and her children, and it was an incredibly happy moment. In 2012, the couple settled in Saint-Martin. Jean-Louis opened a veterinary practice with Nadine's help, and they enjoyed a peaceful life in the tropics. Until January 8, 2017, when Nadine, returning from her friends, discovered her husband's body in the bedroom. He had been shot in the back. There were spent cartridges nearby, but the murder weapon was gone. Also, there were shards of glass from a broken decanter of water on the floor. Of course, many versions arose, including revenge for Charles Edouard. Some even suggested the most absurd theory that the man was killed by the grown-up Charles Edouard himself. But that, of course, was nonsense. And who would seek revenge on Jean-Louis, considering that Michel had died in January 2014 from a heart attack? There was no evidence to support this version, and investigators didn't believe it much. They suspected that the man had become a victim of a robbery. Saint-Martin may seem idyllic, but at the same time it can't boast of safety, and robberies, armed assaults, burglaries, and break-ins are not uncommon. Just 4 days before Jean-Louis' murder, 3 people had visited another veterinarian. They demanded money. Judging by the state of the rooms in the Turcan family's house, the killer was clearly searching for something in open drawers and cabinets. The back of the radio receiver was also tampered with, and next to the radio receiver was a knife that didn't belong to the family. Jean-Louis earned well and kept a relatively large amount of money in the back of that device. Detectives hypothesized that the veterinarian fell victim to a burglary gone wrong. It is likely that the robbers thought the owners wouldn't be home and would be at a party with friends. However, Jean-Louis was scheduled for knee surgery. He wanted to rest and preferred to spend the evening at home. Nadine left alone. When the robbers burst into the house, Jean-Louis grabbed a crystal decanter, swinging it to defend himself or fight off the criminals. They opened fire and killed the homeowner. They found a hidden stash in the radio receiver, took expensive watches and some jewelry, and then fled. Everything pointed to the fact that the police considered the robbery version as the primary theory. However, there was widespread shock when on April 28, 2017, Nadine was arrested. The reason was that gunpowder residue was found on both of her hands. The police believed that she could have either been the shooter or an accomplice, and it turned out that Nadine had a motive. After 17 years of marriage, the woman became tired of her husband controlling every aspect of her life, including her email, finances, and relationships with her children. Moreover, she had recently learned that he had made his sister the legal heir to all of his wealth, essentially depriving his wife of inheritance. Nadine had always been a submissive wife, but at some point she had had enough. However, she had thought of divorcing him, not killing him. None of the couple's friends believed that she could have committed the crime. Later, the woman always claimed that when she found her husband on the floor, she ran to him and tried to help, which is why gunpowder residue ended up on her hands. Investigators consulted experts and had to acknowledge that this could have been true. Additionally, she had spent the evening with friends and had not left. Therefore, the prosecution did not pursue the case against her. The last hope of finding Jean-Louis' killer rests with science, as a knife with male DNA, which was never identified, was found at the crime scene. To this day, we do not know what happened to Charles Edouard that night, nor do we know who killed Jean-Louis in the West Indies 25 years later. This case will forever remain one of the most mysterious in the criminal history of France. Jean-Louis' friends hope that now, when neither Michel nor the biological father of the child are alive, someone will come forward with the full truth. They believe that Charles Edouard is alive and living somewhere in Israel. Private detectives and independent journalists have not given up trying to find the boy in Israel, and one of them even managed to find a school document that recorded the full name of the boy, Charles Edouard Turcan. However, it turned out to be another false lead. To be honest, I really want to believe that Charles Edouard is alive, that he already has his own family, children, and has finally found happiness. Because otherwise, one has to come to terms with a very harsh reality. For 7 years, the boy did not live but merely existed, truly needed by no one. The parents used him to hurt each other, and no one thought about the feelings of the child. His short life ended in murder. But even after his death, few mourned Charles Edouard, the kind, gentle, shy boy who loved animals in his small garden. Everything she said, from the very first word to the last, was being recorded. Every word she spoke was destined to be used against her. She threatened to destroy his life. And in a way, it was true. She tried, but with that one call, everything changed. She would never be able to hurt him again. Now her life was hanging by a thread, and it depended on him. All this time, while she enjoyed the show, she was the clown being watched with growing curiosity. The police were with him, guiding, orchestrating, and just when they began to doubt the case would ever be solved, the killer brought them closer to the truth than he ever intended. San Luis Obispo, California. Angel Gate Academy, run by the U.S. National Guard, was something akin to a boot camp, a place where mentors skillfully guided and taught valuable skills to young people who might otherwise have taken a wrong turn in life. It was here that Angelina first took notice of Jose Francisco Rodriguez, who preferred to be called Frank. Angie had already been married 3 times and was raising her daughter, Autumn. Frank was also divorced. Both Angie and Frank had military backgrounds, and they were drawn to the idea of working with troubled teens. Kind, empathetic, and able to connect easily with kids, Frank immediately caught Angie's attention. Frank had certainly taken notice of the attractive woman with large brown eyes and a warm, captivating smile. But behind Angelina's sincere expression were painful memories she rarely spoke about. She told Frank that when she was very young, her father had walked out on the family, leaving her mother to raise 2 daughters alone. Her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep them afloat, so Angelina was effectively raised by her older sister and their grandfather. Grandfather molested little Angelina from early childhood until almost the end of her school years. She herself was still essentially a child when she realized she was pregnant. Angie terminated the pregnancy. All this affected her so much that Angelina wanted to end her life. But she survived, moved away from her grandfather, and began to live independently. At 19, Angelina got married for the first time to Hector Gonzalez. But the marriage ended quickly. She married again, this time to Tom Fuller. During that marriage, she gave birth to 2 beautiful daughters, Autumn and Alicia. For a while, it seemed like Angelina's life was finally coming together, as if the universe was rewarding her for all the suffering she had endured in her youth. But fate had more heartbreak in store. When Alicia was just 13 months old, she died in her crib due to a defective pacifier. A part of it broke off and became lodged in her throat. Although the manufacturer would later recall all pacifiers of that model, it was too late for Alicia. The young couple couldn't recover from the tragedy, and they eventually separated. Angelina tried once more to find happiness in marriage with Don Combs. By the time she met Frank, Angelina had all but given up on love. But Frank believed they were soulmates. He was ready to care for her and her daughter, and he promised they would never have to suffer like that again. In April 2000, 41-year-old Frank and 32-year-old Angelina became husband and wife. Shortly after, Frank was offered a teaching position in the quiet Los Angeles suburb of Montebello. He accepted the job, and the family relocated. They were happy in their new home, but misfortune seemed to follow them. Not long after the wedding, a gas leak occurred in the house. If Frank hadn't noticed it in time, the consequences could have been catastrophic. At 3 a.m. on Saturday, September 9, 2000, before the sun had risen over the Los Angeles suburb of Montebello, a panicked woman called the police. She was terrified. Her husband had suddenly fallen ill, and she feared he wouldn't survive the night. By the time emergency responders arrived, the man was already dead. He was lying face down on the bedroom floor. He had vomited before dying and had a small amount of blood coming from his nose. Not unusual at death scenes. The deceased was 41-year-old Frank Rodriguez. The 911 call had come from his wife, Angelina. She told authorities that she had fallen asleep on the couch while watching TV. When she woke up and went to the bedroom, she found Frank lying on the floor. He had vomited and was unresponsive. That's when she called for help. Angelina didn't cry, but the officers knew from experience that people grieve in different ways. She told them Frank hadn't been feeling well for the past few days. She had taken him to the hospital, where doctors suspected food poisoning. They advised her to keep him hydrated with fluids like Gatorade and tea, and to make sure he got plenty of rest. Angelina said she followed all the medical advice carefully, but Frank didn't improve. And that night, she found him on the bedroom floor. She told the officers she couldn't understand how food poisoning could have taken her husband's life. The officers didn't have an answer either. The coroner examined Frank's body. There were no signs of trauma or injury. Could it have been a heart attack? A stroke? The coroner took the body for autopsy to find out. Detectives asked for permission to look around the house. Angie agreed. The home was neat and orderly. There was no blood, nothing out of place, and no indication that Frank had tripped or fallen. Nothing at all seemed suspicious. The officers left Angelina to grieve and to notify Frank's family about his sudden, unexplained death. Frank grew up in Lincoln, Illinois. He was the eldest of 5 children. When he was 8 years old, his parents divorced. After his father left, young Frank stepped into the role of man of the house, taking care of his younger siblings, walking them to school, making breakfast. As he got older, he joined the Navy and served during the Gulf War, Desert Storm. He wrote to his mother regularly, kept her updated on his life, and sent her gifts from every country he visited. But like many young men suddenly thrust into the vastness of the world, Frank picked up a few bad habits. He began to drink. Fortunately, he recognized early on that he was heading down the wrong path, and he made the choice to quit drinking. That turning point is part of what made him so well suited to working with troubled teens at Angel Gate Academy, where he landed a job after 14 years of Navy service. It was there that he met Angie, and the two quickly fell in love. Just 5 months after his family had celebrated his wedding, they were receiving the devastating news of Frank's death. Like Angelina, they struggled to believe it, and even more so to accept it. Meanwhile, the medical examiner performed the autopsy and found nothing. No signs of trauma from a blow, fall, gunshot, or stab wound. Frank's organs were in excellent condition. There were no signs of respiratory failure, no asthma-related issues. He was, by all accounts, a completely healthy man, except that he was dead. The autopsy raised more questions than it answered. The police began to think they had no choice but to rule the death as an unfortunate accident. But then they received a clue, one that would completely change the course of the investigation. Angelina wanted the detectives to know that there was someone who didn't like her husband, a former colleague from Angel Gate Academy. His name was Chad Holloway, and he had been accused of child abuse and even molestation. An investigation had been launched after someone reported him. According to Angelina, Chad held a grudge against Frank because he believed Frank had reported him. And since on the Wednesday before Frank's death, he had agreed to accompany a school bus to the camp, Angelina suspected that Chad had poisoned her husband. The next day, investigators went to the camp to speak with the staff, focusing especially on Chad. They interviewed about 20 people and discovered 2 important things. First, the allegations against Chad had already been thoroughly investigated and were completely unfounded. No one had ever believed them. Second, everyone at the academy loved Frank and considered him a friend, including Chad. On the other hand, Chad didn't deny being very angry at whoever had cast suspicion on him and threatened to find and punish that person. He said he had served in the military and been through a lot, but had never been as terrified as when he was accused of molesting children. Chad was genuinely furious, and according to the police, someone in that state might be driven to commit a crime. But there was one catch. Frank had agreed to accompany the kids on the trip to the camp at the very last minute. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and until Frank got off the bus in San Luis Obispo, no one at the camp knew he would be coming. Chad couldn't have known either, which meant he couldn't have prepared poison to kill the victim days later. It was unlikely that Chad always carried poison with him. There was more. Chad said that when he and Frank met, they hugged and chatted for a couple of minutes. Then Chad went to the kids, and Frank and the bus were supposed to head back to Los Angeles. Chad had no opportunity to slip anything into Frank's food or drink while he was at the camp. Moreover, everyone who saw Frank noted that he already looked unwell, sickly, thin, and a shadow of the man he used to be. Meanwhile, Frank's relatives arrived in Los Angeles to say their final goodbyes. After the church service, Angelina, Frank's sisters, and his mother got into a limousine that took them to the cemetery. As Frank's sisters discussed what could have caused such a sudden death, Angelina declared that he might have been poisoned. She pointed out a plant commonly found throughout the city, oleander. People often get poisoned by it. Looking out the window at the beautiful blooming bushes, she said, "That's oleander." Oleander, which grows along highways, especially in Central and Northern California, is indeed highly toxic. But why did she specifically mention it? Frank's sisters and mother were stunned by her suggestion. Even the coroner had no clue what caused the death. Later, the women called the sheriff's office and asked them to investigate the possibility that Frank had been poisoned by oleander. Investigators tried to speak with Angelina directly to have her repeat her oleander theory, but she pretended not to understand where they were going with it. However, through the sliding glass door of Angelina's house, the backyard was clearly visible. There stood a magnificent, blooming neighbor's bush that slightly overhung Angelina's property. It was a large, branching oleander with stunningly beautiful flowers, narrow, dark green leaves, and a deadly poison. While Frank's death remained a mystery, Angelina's detailed knowledge and then sudden amnesia about the oleander seemed suspicious. The forensic expert's report on oleander poisoning was expected to take some time, so the detective spoke with Angelina's friends to learn more about her character. One of her longtime close friends was Palmyra Gorham. Palmyra revealed that, as close friends, they often joked in ways others might find inappropriate. Shortly after Angelina's marriage, she complained to Palmyra about being bored in the relationship. When Palmyra asked why she hadn't divorced her fourth husband like the previous three, Angelina replied, "He's insured, so it's worth putting up with. If I kill him, I'll get the money," she added. The friends then jokingly discussed how such a thing might be done and what poisoning methods they had heard of. Palmyra mentioned oleander, saying it could be mixed into tea because its bitter taste is easily masked. Angelina became very interested and fired Palmyra a dozen questions about oleander. At the time, Palmyra thought nothing of it. They were just joking. But Frank's sudden and unexplained death shook her confidence in that. Finally, the forensic expert's report arrived. It confirmed that oleander was indeed found in Frank's body, but not in a lethal amount. This left the investigators puzzled. Did this mean two types of poison were used? And how could they determine what the second one was? Since oleander was definitely present in Frank's system, the police focused their attention on Angelina. However, the detectives decided to withhold this information, even though it was difficult, as Angelina was constantly bombarding them with calls. There's nothing unusual about desperate calls from the victim's loved ones demanding justice. But Angie's daily calls had a different purpose. She didn't hide the fact that she wanted the insurance payout, and the investigators realized money was her main driving force. However, the insurance company explained that since Frank died within 2 years of the policy being taken out, they would first conduct their own investigation, and Angie wouldn't receive any money until the cause of death was determined. Angie likely didn't know this. So, if Frank was poisoned, could financial gain be the possible motive? The investigators decided to dig deeper to find out. The insurance agent told detectives that Angelina and Frank had purchased a $250,000 life insurance policy. Frank frankly didn't understand why they needed it. After all, they were already covered through his job in the National Guard. But Angelina was so insistent that the agent just leaned back in his chair and watched her do the convincing for him. The couple also agreed to take out a $50,000 policy on Angelina, but never followed through. The agent revealed that before sunrise the morning after Frank's death, Angelina called him, asking when she would receive the money. She bombarded him with calls, just like she did the police. She was in a rush to buy a house and wanted the agent to confirm to her realtor that the payout was imminent, but he refused. He simply couldn't be certain of anything yet. After speaking with the agent, the investigators were nearly certain Angelina believed she had committed the perfect murder. But maybe it was too perfect, and she was about to discover she wouldn't get a dime without a confirmed cause of death. Tests for various known poisons came back negative, leaving investigators desperate to figure out what toxin had been used. They started a cat-and-mouse game with Angelina, convincing her that the cause of death couldn't be confirmed without identifying the exact poison. She called almost every day, while they kept stalling, assuring her the coroner was still working. What else could she do? Surely she thought the police were clueless enough not to catch on if she didn't reveal the poison herself. In early October, Angelina called the detectives again with a fascinating story. She said an unknown man had contacted her from an untraceable number. The caller claimed to have great respect for her late husband and insisted he had something important to share. Allegedly, Chad Holloway told him the police wouldn't be able to pin the murder on him. Then the call started cutting out, and all Angelina could hear was, "Ask them about antifreeze." It sounded convincing, but Angie forgot one thing. The police could easily get phone records and verify that no anonymous calls were made to her. Still, the detectives got what they wanted. Antifreeze wasn't on the list of traditional poisons tested for during the autopsy, so the coroner started a special analysis. While waiting for the results, Angie kept trying to frame Chad. 2 anonymous letters demanding Chad's arrest arrived at the sheriff's office fax. At the end of January 2001, 4 months after Frank's sudden death, the medical examiner found ethylene glycol, a component of antifreeze, in the man's body. And thus the cause of death was antifreeze poisoning. In any other situation, it could have been assumed that the man ingested it accidentally. But considering all the gathered information and the amount of ethylene glycol in Frank's body, in addition to the oleander, the coroner concluded that the man had been murdered. The investigators also had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The only thing left was to prove it. They spoke once again with Angelina's relatives and friends. It turned out that once in the presence of Angelina, Palmyra's boyfriend and mother had discussed antifreeze. They talked about how it's sweet and that, for example, children might drink it without suspecting anything, which is very dangerous. In other words, Angelina was told about 2 methods of poisoning, rare but effective. The police suspected that she first gave her husband a little oleander, which made him feel ill. But that wasn't enough to kill him, so she switched to antifreeze. The question was how to prove it. The detectives met with Chad again and asked for his help. They emphasized that they believed in his innocence and that Angelina was behind all his troubles, including the accusations of molesting minors. Chad readily agreed to assist. They outlined a rough script for the conversation, and he called Angelina. However, the call was short. Chad only managed to ask why she was accusing him of poisoning Frank with antifreeze. Angelina didn't respond, instead demanding to know how he got her number, saying she shouldn't be talking to him, and then hung up. Less than a minute later, Angelina contacted the detective, claiming Chad had called her and threatened her. According to her, Chad told her to keep quiet or she would regret it because they wouldn't be able to catch him anyway. The detective asked, "Did he threaten you?" And Angelina confirmed, "Yes, I'm scared to death." Of course, Chad never said any of that, as the police witnessed. Angelina was arrested and taken to jail to await trial for the murder of Frank Rodriguez. During a search of her home, officers found a napkin with the sheriff's fax number on it, meaning she could have been the sender of the anonymous letters the detectives had received. Additionally, officers found a piece of paper where the grieving widow had outlined how she planned to spend the insurance money. The officers also spoke with Autumn, Angelina's 9-year-old daughter. The girl had genuinely loved Frank as a father and was deeply grieving. She revealed that Frank had a personal bottle for his Gatorade sports drink. Angelina gave this bottle to Autumn and insisted that the girl make sure Frank drank every last drop. Moreover, the girl was strictly forbidden to take even a sip herself. Once in jail, Angelina believed that the only evidence the police had against her was Palmira's testimony. So Angie called her friend and warned her if she didn't change her statement, she would be arrested as an accomplice. Angelina even had a story ready for Palmira to tell the police in her defense. Supposedly, Palmira caught Angelina with her boyfriend and, out of revenge, made up the whole story about the poison. Palmira refused to cooperate, but Angelina didn't calm down. She believed that if her friend couldn't testify, that alone would be enough to plant doubt in the jurors' minds. In the neighboring cell was Gwendolyn Hall, whom Angelina considered a hardened criminal. Angelina decided that Gwendolyn would surely find a way to hire a hitman to kill Palmira, or Gwendolyn would do it herself. Angie promised first $20,000, then increased the offer to $30,000 for the job. In reality, Gwendolyn had no intention of looking for a killer. She chose to turn in the contractor. The police gave her a recorder, and sitting in the cell next to Angelina, she recorded every word. Angelina suggested staging the murder as a robbery gone wrong or framing Palmira's boyfriend. Thus, the police obtained proof that the accused tried to hire a hitman to kill Palmira. But there was a catch. Detectives didn't know if the contractor would stop there. What if Angelina hired someone else? And what if that person really did attack Palmira? Credit where it's due, the detectives came up with another brilliant plan to protect Palmira and help Angelina dig herself even deeper into trouble. They asked Palmira if she would agree to fake her own death. Palmira agreed, reasoning logically that it was better for the police to kill her in jest than for someone else to actually harm her. Using professional makeup, the detectives staged a murder scene and took a photo of the victim. Then, a police officer posing as the hitman met Angelina in prison and showed her the photo of Palmira lying on a bed with a bullet wound in her head. At first, Angelina was horrified and whispered that she was just joking. The detectives listened carefully, relieved, thinking that they had been wrong about her, that maybe she hadn't really planned to kill her friend. But then Angelina's lips curved into a wide, genuine smile and she said, "I'm going home. I'm ready to go home." 2 years after Frank's murder, his wife stood trial. The prosecution presented their theory that Angelina had started by adding oleander to her husband's tea and soups. But since the plan acted too slowly, she began to pour antifreeze into the Gatorade sports drink he consumed. On the witness stand was Palmira, who described how shortly before Frank's death, she had called Angelina and overheard a blender running in the background. Angelina said she was making a special milkshake for her husband. Palmira knew that Frank only drank it when he was unwell and asked if he was sick. Angelina replied, "Not yet." But if Angelina thought Palmira would be the prosecution's key witness, she hadn't counted on one more person. At the trial, Angelina's lover, Palmira's nephew Lauren Moranis, testified. He revealed that shortly before Frank's death, he had complained about being tired of secret meetings. Angelina assured him things would soon change. She had taken care of it. She confessed to him that she had deliberately damaged the gas line in the garage, hoping Frank would either be poisoned by gas or die in a house explosion. If Frank hadn't smelled the gas and called a technician, he could have died then and there. The technician concluded that someone had damaged the gas line in 2 places. Lauren explained he hadn't reported this earlier because he didn't want to get involved. Angelina was found guilty of murder for financial gain, but not guilty of solicitation to murder. However, this was not the worst surprise in the case. When it came time to determine the sentence, the prosecution demanded the death penalty and revealed that Frank's murder was just the tip of the iceberg. A few years ago, in 1992, Angelina, her second husband Tom, and their children, Otham and Alicia, traveled to Michigan to visit relatives and relax. They stopped at a restaurant for dinner, where a stranger approached them and, apologizing, mentioned that the company that manufactured baby pacifiers had received complaints about the model Alicia was using, as it could be dangerous. The woman clearly intended to warn the parents, but she inadvertently gave Angelina an idea. Angie took out a $50,000 insurance policy on her daughter, and just a few days later, Alicia died because of the pacifier. When emergency responders arrived, they were surprised to see Angelina waiting outside. From their experience, they knew a mother would never abandon a choking or suffocating child. Nonetheless, the child's death was ruled an accident. Angelina collected the insurance money and compensation from the manufacturer, totaling about $750,000. She received 60% of that amount, while Tom got the rest. The pacifiers were subsequently recalled. When Angie received the huge payout for Alicia's death, she realized that murder could be a very profitable business, especially if you could get away with it. However, upon closer examination of the evidence, detectives noticed that the pacifier had been pulled and torn with some kind of tool. The child could not have done this herself. An expert declared that the only way Alicia could have died was if the pacifier was broken and deliberately pushed down her throat. She was definitely murdered. But after all these years, detectives and prosecutors could not charge Angelina with murder. Although the case did not proceed, the cause of Alicia's death was officially changed from an accident to homicide. On January 12, 2004, Angelina was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became the 19th woman sentenced to death in California. However, California has a moratorium on the death penalty, so she will remain in prison for the rest of her life. Angelina committed an almost perfect murder. The police would never have discovered the poison that killed Frank, and his wife might have walked away free. But in order to receive the insurance payout, she had to reveal the case for the police. She succeeded in doing that and led investigators to the real killer. By killing her husband, she wanted the insurance money to buy a house, but ended up locked in a solitary death row cell with no money at all.